Hi everyone, welcome back to Scrap Happiness Studio. And today we're going to be looking at more times when you might want to use a paper pattern. And you remember last week we did this pattern, and there's a difference between this pattern and a New York Beauty. And I think you can see the difference right away, as that's points. So we have to cut differently to preserve our points, going back to, I think it was part 2 of free cut piecing when we talked about that. So I made this block once and I liked what I got, but I wanted to show you a problem I ran into, which was the same problem I ran into on the first block. Is when this is what I got, and when I put a ruler on to square this up, I'm having to chop off too much, and which I did chop off, but it made the blocks smaller than I had hoped they would be. You know, having to cut them like this. So I'm hoping this time I'm going to add more of a seam allowance around the whole pattern and see if it solves that problem. When I've done this pattern before, I've just freehanded it and I don't remember having that problem. Anyway, so I drew out my paper pattern, and if you look at this pattern, let's see, I don't know if I have this here. Well, anyway, you can see when I drew it, I started here, and then when I started drawing again, I started above there. That's to preserve the seam allowance for that point, and then I drew it up this way. But then when I start back down this way, I'm preserving that point. I'm cutting in that seam allowance. Now on that other pattern, it didn't matter which way you sewed that arc. On this piece, it's really going to matter. You're going to want to cut. If you cut from left to right, then you're going to piece it back right to left. So I've made my, remember, you never want to cut up your master pattern. You want to leave it alone, but I unthreaded a sewing machine, stacked up a bunch of parchment paper, and sewed through all the cutting lines with my empty sewing machine. And then I just drew over it here again so we could see better what to do. So you can see I've added on extra fabric there because I'm hoping to solve that problem with these points down there. Incidentally, in between this, I thought I'd try some of the off-brand cutting blades that cost so much less than the name brands. Don't buy them. I mean, you can try them, but I did not have good luck with the brand I bought. They lost their edge right away. And you notice normally I don't think rotary cutting and pins go together, but in this case, I'm using some pins because these pieces fly over the place. Oh, I have more seam allowance there than I thought, but that might be useful. Okay, so I'm cutting above that line there, cutting in my seam allowance. And don't do this with your fan running or with a nice breeze blowing through your window, because I think you really do have to cut all these pieces before you can start sewing. I think I've had too much coffee today. Okay, so we can ignore all these pieces for now because we need to piece the arc first. And you remember now we're going to have to sew back this way. So I can ignore these pieces for now. And I'm going to chain piece. Let's see. Yeah, I'm going to do that. I'm going to chain piece these together. And then I'm going to chain piece this stack on, and so on. And so I will come back and show you what I've come up with in a few minutes. Okay. I wanted to show you a little bit about the process of how I sew these together, because if you're a precision piecer, this might drive you crazy to not know where to start and stop sewing, and that your seam allowances are different, and they might be folded differently. So I just wanted to share with you how I'm doing this, because we're not precision piecing here. We just want to get these sewn together so that our finished product looks nice. So we want our seam allowances definitely smaller than a 1/4 inch, and you want the edges to match up as well as you can, but we're not going to be super fussy about that. And you notice I've kept these chained together now because you don't want to get mixed up. You want everything to be staying in relative order. So when I'm getting ready to sew it, I do clip this off. And you can see that looks kind of yucky looking there, but remember, we don't care about our finished edges or sizes or anything. We just want to get these sewn together. So this time it's pretty straight, but it's sure not always. Okay, then I'm going to grab my next one. Let's see how that matches up. You know, you might be concerned which way should your seam allowances go. I don't worry about that very much. Let's see, so I need, so see, that's not, if you're a precision piecer, this might bother you. Don't worry about it. Just make sure you're using that less than a 1/4 inch. Well, that one's pretty good too, but I've had some that were really off, and I just don't worry about it. I just make sure that they get sewn together, you know, as well as I can. And I'll do one more here. I'm looking for one that's particularly off. I do some finger pressing in between here. But see how I'm leaving them all chained together as much as I can, and here's my stacks that I'm going to work into. So this one's kind of like that. Okay, good. I'm going to finish up and I'll be back with you. So far, it's taken me 20 minutes to get this far. Okay, now we're back to the familiar process of making this block that you're familiar with. Now, we've had so many seams in the arc part, it's shrunk up a lot from the original stuff. Let's see. Oh, actually, I think the yellow should go here. This is one of those times when you may want to lay out your blocks and see what should go best together. Remember, I stacked up 4 fabrics in the original stack so that I'd end up with a complete circle. And there's no really good way to do this. So remember I said that whenever your curves don't match anymore, then you want to recut to make sure they're matching again. So I'm just going to kind of eyeball this piece. This skinny piece is really on the bias, so it'll be fine. Actually, I think I'm going to stack this up on here because I think it's important to preserve the curve in the yellow more than in this part. Oh, still not doing it. So you just want to make sure there's two layers all through there. And then I'm going to recut this. And then remember to sew this. You just want to keep it lined up, grab it, and get a pin in there. Okay, so I'm going to sew this on, and then I'll be back to see, I'll sew a block together and see if it solved that problem about getting that arc to fill the whole space. And just a little review of this process again. I have overlapped this piece over this piece, looking to keep about equal parts out there. And I've recut that curve. And then I've grabbed this over and stuck a pin on it. And then I'm going to ease this out in my hands using Karen Stone's Zen of Curve piecing technique. I don't really care what sticks out over there as long as I can get to my pin without stretching anything out too much. I've gently pulled this out in my hand. I'm going to run over and sew this. Okay, I'm back again. This is the block I got. And I think you'll notice that I was hoping adding that extra seam allowance would solve my problem of this not being square like this, and it didn't, because I'm going to want to, I don't know what, I'm not sure exactly. Remember, I'm not so focused on perfection, so I'm still going to lose. And I don't really want this out that far anyway. I'm going to want it really like this so that I get a complete. What I'm aiming for here is, like, when I do sew these, when I square these up and sew them together as squares, I'm going to care about that 1/4 inch there so that I get a whole point, although it's not going to be a perfect point. Okay, so adding the seam allowance did not help, which is interesting. And just one other thing I wanted to mention. I mean, I'll still get blocks, but I've wasted some fabric, I think. But I'll save these scraps and probably piece them into a scrap quilt. One thing I wanted to mention, in these points, you'll see now these, just by chance, ended up right at the thing which, as a traditional quilter, you'd want. But these ones here are what Eleanor Burns would call floating points. She says visually it's just more important to see that point than to have it get chopped off at the top. So that's our adventure today. So don't bother adding a seam allowance around your paper piece because it didn't really help. But we still got a nice block, and I estimated it took me about a half an hour to sew all the arcs. So because that's a process where you don't want anyone interrupting you, really, because you don't want anything to interrupt your flow. And remember to keep your pieces chained together until you have to go sew the next piece on, because you just really want everything keeping it straight. And this is especially important if you have fabric that's the same on both sides, should you accidentally flip a piece upside down or something. So I wasted some fabric, but I still got a nice block, so I'm pretty happy with that. And I hope you'll give it a try and share with me what you get by emailing them to me at my email address that should be up on the website. Okay, thanks so much. Bye.